but we'll certainly hear you. So to start with, if you don't mind introducing yourself, just so that we get it on record, and if you want to say anything as an opening remark, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, we've got questions we can ask you to help us with the inquiry. Dr. Bew, do you want to go first?
My name is Mark Bew. Good afternoon. I chair a company called PCSG, and we're in the space of digital engineering to the built environment. I have chaired the government industry BIM task group between 2011 and 2016, and I continue to be on the board of the Digital Built Britain programme, which has carried on from there. I spent most of my career in construction, either as a contractor or a designer. I was on the board of Costains and Scott Wilson, and I'm an engineer by training.
Dr. Enzer?
Thank you. So my name is Mark Enzer. I'm the Chief Technical Officer at MacDonald, where I'm responsible for professional and technical excellence, which I drive generally through our internal professional networks. I have an interest in build off-site and DFMA. As a number of years back, I worked in Anglian Water for 7 years and introduced what they call product-based delivery, which effectively is a predecessor of DFMA.
Thank you very much.
Design for manufacture and assembly.
Right, don't give us too many initials all the time. We might not.
Certainly.
We might not.
If you do, just qualify so we get it on the record as to what they are. Okay, either of you want to make any opening remarks or anything, or are we just happy to go in? Questions?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, if I might start off, what is it that decides a client to decide whether the project they have, whatever that is, might be suitable for off-site construction? And who are the clients?
So from my point of view, there's a number of considerations that you would want to look at in terms of off-site. Clearly, an asset that's a repeat asset lends itself to an off-site componentised approach. So schools, hospitals, prisons, residential, and some infrastructure, where there's repeat assets or repeat components, would lend themselves to that scenario. The challenges are immediately people want to have variations, and at what level do you standardise those components? And we see in some industries that the componentisation happens at a very low level, or we end up with platform type approaches, which we see in automotive, where we have lots of different components built into standard platforms and then into lots of different products. That level of maturity doesn't yet exist within the construction sector. So building that is one of the key things, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I think why we haven't yet seen many clients take that on board. I think the other challenge that a lot of clients have got is their day job isn't building things, it's running a business. And the fact that a supplier chooses a DFMA route or a design for manufacture route or a traditional route really isn't their problem, and we need to find a way of encouraging it to be their problem and to become part of their selection criteria.
Okay.
So just a couple of things to add to that. I think that if a client is looking at just an individual project, one project at a time, then there might be some project-specific needs that would drive the decision to go with DFMA, Design for Manufacture and Assembly, off-site manufacture. A classic example would be if the site is particularly constrained and there's real advantage in spending a short amount of time on site and therefore delivering components which are effectively ready-made, reduces disruption to public and can work with a constrained site. So that might be a specific reason for a specific project to drive off-site manufacture. But then I think it's also important to note that many clients don't just have individual projects that they want to deliver, but have programs of projects, which are many projects, sometimes quite similar. And in that case, one of the drivers would be to have standardisation and to drive an approach where they design once and build many times, which drives a much more productive way of delivering. So I was really just wanting to kind of extend the question beyond individual projects to programs of many projects.
So at what stage does a client decide that, when you talk about architects, design contractors, and others, at what stage does a client decide, no, this project is suitable for off-site?
I think always as early as possible. And one of the challenges you've got is finding a design team that is capable of designing for manufacturer. If you go to a traditional architect and engineer, you're likely to get a traditional result, and by far the bulk of the industry currently is configured to deliver traditionally. But we see some parts of the market starting to understand the benefits of design for manufacture around quality and cost and speed to site that is encouraged. But it's a very small capacity. And I think it's quite interesting. We're starting to see an emerging capability, but very low capacity. And certainly incentivisation and awareness to clients that these opportunities are available is a key part of any intervention in the future.
Again, something which I'd like to add to that is that, and it's building on what Mark said about as early as possible is better, because I think that off-site manufacture will always fit somewhere in a delivery process. And that delivery process, starting right at the beginning, might begin with something like strategy and then move into planning and outline design and detailed design, and then the construction and then operation and maintenance. And the later it's left in that delivery process to decide on doing off-site manufacture, probably the more it will cost and the less benefit will accrue. And so I think that it becomes very important to design the end-to-end delivery process around off-site manufacture rather than just to bolt it on as an afterthought. And certainly if most of the rest of the delivery process has been traditional and there's been a design already produced and then the contractor has bid against that particular design and then they go for off-site manufacture, it's unlikely to deliver the kind of productivity savings and cost savings that one would hope for. Whereas if the end-to-end delivery process has been designed with DFMA in mind, then the productivity benefits can come.
Okay. So if you wanted to increase the number of buildings, whether they're prisons, schools, hospitals, to be off-site constructed, who's the key person that you have to educate or influence?
The key thing we have to do is to create capacity in the market. We've currently got a situation where anyone who opens a factory to build components carries all of the risk around building those components. And if the market doesn't take up the opportunity around procuring those components for all the failures that we've just described, he fails. The cost of the factory and the labour, it means his overheads overtake his takings. And so finding ways of maintaining the market around those components so we can get the volumes up to pay for the overheads and then invest back into new components is the key. So there's a whole variety of people that along the value chain that need to be aware of this intervention. Clearly, the client is the ultimate client around encouraging this, and then the specifiers, the designers, the engineers, and the commercial teams that are then in the chain of decisions down through this process need to be aware of the benefits and supportive of the benefits to the point where actually an order is placed on that factory with a DFMA design that then goes to site.
Ernest Young, you had to wonder.
Ask Mark Enzer. I was really taken with the Mott MacDonald evidence, but the one thing it appeared to me to hint at was that actually there isn't really a great evidence base as yet about the benefits of off-site. There's a lot of theoretical benefits and theoretical downsides, but have we actually got a really substantial evidence base yet? And if not, what should be done about that?
So we don't have a substantial evidence base, but I think we've got enough of an evidence base to be quite convinced that DFMA design off-site manufacture can deliver genuine savings. And I think in order to get the more substantial evidence base, we need to do more of it. But I think that what we have seen is evidence in the water industry, in transport, in energy. So most of the major sectors of economic infrastructure to convince us that there is some genuine benefit in going down this route.
And is there a thing that we have to do? I mean, is there some process that we need to do? Because presumably people aren't going to jump unless they see the evidence that persuades them.
I think evidence is part of it, but I think there's also an element of leadership needed, which in many ways goes back to the previous question. Who needs to change in order to bring about the industry change? And I think that really does need leadership throughout the value chain. So at one end, there needs to be leadership within client organisations to commit to what is quite a big change, because as I explained, it really needs to change the whole delivery process, not just the construction part of it. So that takes real leadership in a client organisation. But that's not enough. There needs to be change in the procurement department, because generally procurement departments have grown up on believing that the route to value is the lowest price against a particular specification. Whereas what DFMA points to is value that comes from lower whole life cost and better outcomes for customers. So procurement has to change, and that's a big change. And then also, as Mark indicated, the supply chain itself needs to change. So that means that if we join that all up through the whole value chain, that's a lot of change and a lot of leadership is needed. And I think that is tough.
That's just building that as well. I think part of the challenges the current value chain is incentivised to spend against man hours rather than outcomes. So actually you're incentivising reverse to reduce the cost and standardise. So we need to look at all of the incentivisation and contractual relationships all the way through the supply chain to ensure that everyone is focused on the same outcomes. And at that point we can then start to create a new market in effect. I think there is a bit of a challenge here where we've got a traditional market and a DFMA outcomes-based market, and we've got this thing in the middle which is the journey between one and the other. We actually need to be one or the other for it to work properly. Otherwise we never create a market for enough components to get the unit price down.
Lord Reynolds and then Lord Warwick.
I know nothing about this market, but from what you're saying, it suggests to me that is there a case for vertical integration of the supply chain? I mean, does anybody do the lot?
Very few. Some are getting closer, but very few do the lot. And if you go back, when I started in the mid early 80s, a lot of the tier ones had the lot. They had all the subcontractors, the project managers, the designers, all this. So Trafalgar House and Tarmac and Lang, all those sorts of organisations were vertically integrated. The challenge with that is you end up with lots of layers of overheads and profit in each of the parts of the organisation, which add up to a non-competitive position, because clients have got into the habit of taking the least cost of each of the packages within a project, adding them all up and saying that's the cost of the project rather than the project in the round. And that is effectively what happened when we moved from traditional contracting to design and build contracting late 80s, early 90s.
So what you're saying, it is actually more expensive to have something which is vertically integrated? Or is it a failure of marketing?
There is a big difference between the tender cost and the outturn, and you need to look at both numbers. They are not the same number, and price and cost aren't the same numbers either. And so once you unpack those, you actually see that by vertically integrating, you do get a lower cost at the end.
May I add to that answer? Because actually just this morning, across at the Institution of Civil Engineers, there's a launch of Project 13, which in many ways speaks to exactly your question. And that is a movement within the infrastructure industry to transform the industry to something that is more vertically integrated, but not necessarily vertically integrated by one organisation being vertically integrated, but many organisations coming together in an enterprise to be more integrated. And so at the heart of that is this role of the integrator, and that is exactly what they call it, whose job it is to pull things together. And that effectively delivers precisely what you were getting at.
Thank you.
Morgan and then Lord Warwick. Next question.
I was fascinated by what you said about moving to whole life valuation. But how on earth do we make that happen? I mean, how do you somehow, because it's not just about sort of lots of little bits of evidence, isn't it? Somehow, I mean, it's quite a transformational way of doing procurement and management of huge projects. I mean, what's your suggestion to us that we ought to be suggesting is the way forward to demonstrate how we need this significant shift?
I think that there's a number of steps in a journey. There isn't one step. We can't make that. You know, moving an industry that's 10% of GDP is going to take some moving. It's a big thing. To go to the end game a little bit more, then step back. The three numbers that we're interested in are the capital cost of the asset, the operational cost of the asset, and the cost of delivering services through that asset, whatever it may be. And if we look at the kind of ratios, roughly at the moment there's 90-ish billion of capex in the UK, 40-ish% is public, the rest private, 125 billion around services, 500 billion around delivering services using for the cost of doctors, nurses, train drivers, etc. If we can make our assets more efficient and deliver more with those resources that are delivering the services, ultimately we can then put more money back into the capex, which starts to create a virtuous circuit. To do that, and the Green Book process, the investment process allows us to do that. To do that, we need good quality evidence, and we don't have that at the moment. We also have a very long time scale of the life of an asset, so we need to gather that data over a long time. So clearly, as we start to gather better quality data with measurements and Internet of Things and sensors and all these sorts of things, we will have better insights as to how assets perform and how consumers consume those assets. That is some way off. But that will give us the evidence to do exactly what you just described, to start to learn and self-learn from how we do it.
And is that sort of built into the system now? I mean, are people starting to gather that?
We are slowly edging that way. Yeah, we've started that journey.
And when you say we, who's we in that situation?
Certainly in terms of public procurement, we're starting to procure data with our assets. It's not perfect, but it's the first step in that process. It will start to improve as time goes on. We're seeing standards like 5G and the sensor standards starting to become more, more common, so it will be easier to gather that data. But in the short term, to create some steps, we have to do some things in the next 5 and 10 years. And starting to look at how we can encourage and incentivise the use of standard components and how we can incentivise the growth of skills in design teams to be able to configure those components is something we can do now, and we should look at incentives around enabling that.
In the first question, you asked very much about the advantages of the system, but you carefully, helpfully answered both the advantages and the disadvantages, which is a much more balanced answer. But can I ask some more about some of the disadvantages, drawbacks of this process? Are there any financial drawbacks, both on cash flow and on other aspects of? Can you talk a bit more about the requirements or the trend towards making everything the same, identical houses, identical blocks, which is fine for prisons, but they may not be what the customers want in a housing development.
For sure, some have less vote than others, for sure. So let's start with the second one first. One of the great things about the UK is we have fantastically diverse architecture. And we've still got good architects in the country. We must not lose that. That creates us. That creates our identity, and the impact of not only on the nation, but also the quality of life of our citizens. Absolutely, we must not get to a cookie cutter world where everything looks the same. That would be absolutely catastrophic. And we see some nations that are kind of heading that direction, and the impact of poor quality architecture has an impact around social outcomes and mental health and those sorts of things. We know from work that Mind and Shelter have done, the quality of residential accommodation has a big impact on mental health. Mental health is one of the biggest bills within the NHS budget, so we mustn't be going down there. So I don't sign up to cookie cutters or standards or standard architecture. We need diversity in our architecture. It needs to work for us. And there's absolutely no reason why standard components can't lead us to high quality architecture as well. If we look at our automotive industry, standard components make up lots of different vehicles. You look at a BMW 3 Series, the underlying chassis and assembly for that is a 2 Series, 3 Series, a Mini and something else. You've got 4 cars with all those components, and the 3 Series, I think you have 3 million combinations of the 3 Series. So there is no excuse for going down a completely consistent architecture. So absolutely agree with that. So the disadvantages around finances, you mentioned cash flow, and I alluded to the same thing. absolutely, it is a very different cash flow profile around opening a factory, buying materials, buying labour, and having stock sitting in a yard. It's very different to all the tier one contractors' balance sheets are geared around not doing that and letting someone else do that. If they need to start to change, there needs to be a different model around the design of their balance sheet and their operating models. And we've seen some organisations start that journey. Langs, for example, have factories as well as contracting elements. But the big challenge is, if you can afford and you can fund the investment around the factory and the labour and the materials, is you have to keep the utilisation up. Otherwise, you run out of cash, and that is just a fact of life. And we have to be able to create a market where not only can we keep the capacity matched with the demand, but that we can get enough capacity through the machinery to invest in new product in the future. Because the first ones we design won't be good enough. We'll need to iterate them over time as well. So I think the incentives that we should be placing from and the leadership we should give, as Mark said, from government should be around enabling that market to exist. We shouldn't go and tell them how to do it. They know how to do it. What we should do is create a market for them to be able to thrive.
If I can add to a few of those, not so much on the financial side, but other potential drawbacks. Some people would suggest that manufacturing can stifle innovation, but I'm not quite sure why that should be the case, because manufacturing doesn't seem to stifle innovation in automotive or aerospace, but it's certainly something that people mention. I think that there's also potentially a cost initially where there's a lack of manufacturing capacity to do all the things we might want to do, and that would maybe take some attention to address it, and potentially concern about being tied to one particular supplier rather than having a lot of choice in the supply chain. So that's a potential drawback. And then I think there are another couple of drawbacks which are effectively the other side of a benefit coin. And I would point out those to do with quality and adaptability. So on the quality side, in order to make design for manufacture and assembly work, there needs to be much higher quality, which you can get in a factory. And some might say that is tough to get. Aiming for higher quality, it's easier to bodge a job, so why not even try for quality in the first place? I wouldn't follow that argument, but it's an argument that could be made. And then I think there's also the ability to change things later on, because I think that in this country we have been used to being able to change things when we're on site. There's been enough flexibility to kind of redesign while we're building it. And that luxury, if you call it a luxury, goes away with design for manufacturing assembly. I would say that it's a good thing to design it properly first and then assemble it on site, but it is a flexibility that we lose, and some would say that was a disadvantage.
Yeah. You mentioned, Dr. Hughes, the automotive industry, and I was wondering whether there was a comparable in that in 1900 you bought the chassis and had a coach builder build the body on it, and then Henry Ford came along with this brilliant idea of doing it all in the factory. It was only when he invested the money to make the factory that actually automotive engineering took great steps forward, and cars became better and cheaper proportionately. Is that a valid comparison?
There's a saying, I'm sure it's attributed to Henry Ford, and it goes back to the client conversation we had earlier. If I'd asked the client, he would have asked for a faster horse.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, there is some of that in here. A catalyst like Henry Ford or digitisation, or there are a number of them that we could identify is the key. We fundamentally know it's the right answer. We need to catalyse it now, and I think he's a really good example around that. As an example, the client's always right, but sometimes he needs to be helped to understand what's right.
I think it's quite interesting that manufacturing in automotive has gone through another few revolutions since then, and we could point to lessons learned and driven by Toyota, as another thing that we can learn from in automotive manufacturing. I think that there are other manufacturing analogues we can look at as well, like shipbuilding and aerospace. And maybe the good news of this is that all those analogues do exist. We can learn from what they've already been through. So it's quite odd in a way that construction should be coming to this party quite so late. A lot of the lessons are already very well learnt.
Lord Reynolds and then Lord Hunt.
Take the analogy of shipbuilding or whatever. I mean, one of the reasons why things didn't change very quickly was because of the vested interests of the various trades and professions. Are you portraying something where there are strong vested interests? For example, architects, I would have thought, wouldn't do too well out of this in terms of numbers, because there'd be fewer of them around. Construction firms might not do too well out of it either. Because in my own experience, if you change things on site, it costs you an arm and a leg, and that's probably where the construction firms make a lot of their money. I mean, are we up against vested interests in the professions and the trades?
Absolutely. That's exactly the point I made earlier. We have a new world, and we have where we are now, and we have to unpick where we are now. And this combination of old and new, which is where we find ourselves at the moment, is the worst of all worlds. In fact, we've got the cost of the new world and the disbenefits of the old. The leadership point we're making is absolutely we've got to make a step and do something different. And the emerging strategies around manufacturing, digitisation, and productisation, and those sorts of things are where we have to be heading now. What we have to do though is work out the right intervention to move us from here to here. Otherwise, you'll be left with those vested interests. The challenge though is we have an existing demand and capacity that we have to keep going while we create this new machine in flight and transfer. We can't stop building schools and hospitals and roads. So how do we make that transition? We've been so far with the building information modelling digitisation programme and the existing interventions made in manufacturing, trying to fix the old model. We now need to actually work out how we go to the new model. Otherwise, we'll be continually in this place we are now.
So how can building information modelling and other digital technologies be used in conjunction with off-site manufacture? Does this facilitate or necessitate? I was just wondering, I think in our previous discussions, I think many of us have been thinking of rather large buildings, large schools, hospitals, and off-site modelling. But there's an enormous amount of building in Britain is quite small builders who are not could be more progressive. And I just wondered as whether it's rather like just going to the supermarket rather than having your own manufacture. Is there a trend to use off-site manufacturing where, as it were, lots and lots of contractors can go there and get modelling help, get building help, and so on? Because we've been really thinking of sort of a big constructor having his big factory, but I wonder whether there's in some sense wholesale off-site manufacturers that lots and lots of smaller businesses, building businesses, could make use of.
So the two really important issues there. One is around the digitisation of the sector to help manufacturing, and the other one is around capacity growth for components, I think. Certainly, we've seen challenges where contractors have built factories and started to generate products, and their competition are unwilling to go to them because they are the competition, and so they want to avoid them and go somewhere else. So growing a market outside, as a contractor, growing a market outside your own market is very challenging, and that's one of the reasons why most of the tier ones came out of that market in the 80s and 90s. So having standalone businesses that make these components is the likely area, because you become expert in those components rather than a jack of all trade at all sorts of things. So that is likely to happen. It's happening in other sectors.
No, it's happening, is it?
Is it happening? It comes and goes, unfortunately, because we end up with this cyclical financial market that we described earlier. So the first thing that happens in a downturn is the factories run out of work, the overheads cost more than they can afford, and they shut them down. So we've been through that loop lots of times already. So we're trying to avoid. That's what we're absolutely trying to avoid. One way that we can start to look at that is exactly as you say, to start consolidating spend from many builders into a fewer number of manufacturers, and that's what we see in automotive. There's only one Bosch and one Dunlop, and they make all the tyres, and Bosch make all the injectors and what have you. that sort of thing is the sort of thing that needs to happen for the market to grow. To do that, that's where the digitalisation process comes in. So if those components can be available digitally and found digitally, we can start to create an online market. And the most famous online aggregator are systems like Amazon and eBay and those sorts of things, where you go on, type in concrete plank or column or stairs or pump or whatever it may be, and there's a whole array of those components that you can procure and drag them off and put them into your design, and away you go. Those kind of procurement aggregators are likely to be part of the equation when it comes to growing this market. And whether government should intervene in that aggregation strategy or not is one of the decisions that needs to be made.
So may I add to that? Which is just to say that I think that building information modelling is a huge BIM. So the building information modelling is a huge enabler of design for manufacture and assembly. And I would say, as we go forwards, it would almost become a necessary enabler of it. It's very difficult to imagine an efficient approach to off-site manufacture that doesn't use information modelling. But I think that we should see that as a great opportunity, and not just in the building and the assembly part of it, because information ends up being the golden thread that joins up the overall delivery process. And any loss of information in that delivery process is a loss of value. And so we can see the same kind of information being very relevant in the logistics, which is a key part of design for manufacture and assembly, and a key enabler for its success. But then it's not just about the delivery, it then gets into the operation, the maintenance and the use of the assets. And again, information ends up being a golden thread that runs through all of that. And so I would see BIM as being a key enabler to start with, but it's just the beginning of something which is of even more value when we recognise the information that sits behind it.
Lord Maxton.
Can I just ask, does what you're proposing necessarily mean changes in planning laws? Because that, I think, is at the heart of a lot of what we do. Planning is, of course, a local government function, not a national government function, whereas in other countries it tends to be a national government that's planning. So do we need changes in the planning laws?
I think there's really a question. There's a number of touch points into here. Whether there's a direct touch point, I think, is a different question. Good, high-quality data in the planning process is something that we lack and absolutely need. So digitisation of mapping, floods, demographics, people flows, other data available for the planning process absolutely is a key enabler in getting transparency around planning and those sorts of things. Do we need it to encourage DFMA? Possibly, but I don't think it's not one of the first places I would start, probably. Unless there was a specific need around, as Mark says, things like logistics. If there's particularly sensitive places, you could look at it as part of the planning process around deliveries through small villages and all those sorts of things. But I think it's probably a periphery rather than a direct.
Mr. Enzer, do you have any? Brett?
No, not on planning. No.
Okay. Lord Mayor.
Can I come back to the sort of barriers to the sort of wider use of BIM, and perhaps ask that in the context of R&D and evidence, and what do you both feel are the things that ought to be done to make BIM much more widely adopted? What are the R&D priorities?
Yes, so I think when it comes to building information modelling, and Mark is really the expert in this because he defined it all, but I think that we are at different stages for different levels of BIM. So if we look at the entry level 2 BIM for design and build, and that would enable the design for manufacture and assembly that we just talked about, the adoption in infrastructure is quite well advanced now, and we are getting the benefit from that. I think that there's further for it to go, and so the strategy related to that really, I think, is to drive the wider adoption of it. But I don't think it specifically needs R&D. In many ways, that's already happened for that level of BIM. However, as we look forwards and we can see more value in a greater integration of information across the whole of the delivery process, including operation, maintenance and use that I referred to earlier, then that does need R&D, because that's making use of information that we in ways that we haven't done before. So I would say that the answer really depends on which aspect of BIM we're looking at.
Sorry, can I just have one follow-up question? If we look at the City of London, and these amazing number of buildings that have been put up, I mean, can you sort of look at a building and say, what was the BIM used for each of these? I mean, were they off-the-shelf BIMs that are being used by the structural engineers and the architects? I mean, perhaps because they've all been successful, as it were.
So if you look around the City of London now at the walkie-talkie, the cheese grater, the gherkin, a few famous ones, all of those were BIM-enabled or digitally-enabled projects where the design was done digitally in a computer. And
did they have to invent the BIM system for those buildings, or were they standard ones which were already available?
So the BIM tool itself, the Building Information Modelling tool itself, is an environment where you can create designs. So you can create geometry. And so if you look at the gherkin, there was a series of floor plates that were designed and a shape, and you can attach information to each of those components within the building. So the glass cladding or the floor plates would have had some information around manufacturing, around weight, around stress, around maintenance, cost, time, and those sorts of things. So in effect, building information modelling we should think about really as a database of drawings and information that describe the design of that building.
But you have to do that whether construction is offsite or not.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's a two different issue.
Yeah.
UK software, or is this imported software?
Unfortunately, not dissimilar to other markets. We've invented a lot of these things, and they've gone to America to be capitalised. So the two biggest vendors in the market, Autodesk and Bentley, are both US-based businesses. We've got lots of organisations in the UK that are very innovative about new functionality, but often it gets bought and sold very early in its life and taken to the States to be grown. And we see lots and lots of acquisitions going on in the sector at the moment. There are two companies being sold, UK originated companies being sold, for just over £1 billion, but in the last 3 or 4 months. So it's a very active market.
Can I come back to the evidence that you both mentioned a number of times, and the role of BIM in providing the evidence, particularly in terms of performance of infrastructure assets. And you talked about operation, maintenance, and use. I mean, presumably there is really a huge opportunity to combine BIM, which is a digitalization of the building or the infrastructure, with actual data that will come from measurement, using advanced sensing technologies and so on. So can you say a bit more about that? Because that would add an awful lot more to BIM when you actually know and have the evidence as to how infrastructure is in fact performing.
Okay, so if I give a really short synopsis of 2011 to now, back in 2011 the government industry came up with a digitisation strategy which was basically rolling out building information modelling into the sector. And we took an approach where we had a series of steps or levels, and the level 2 intervention that we made was a very small step to take a very big industry along a journey. And that step was about engaging suppliers, engaging clients, and engaging the standards authorities into a relationship that enabled us to start to create an environment that used data and BIM information to deliver assets. And we worked with the core government departments, particularly MOJ and Highways and Environment, to become a data procuring client. We work with the supply chain to become able to grow capacity within their environments, and we helped BSI create a series of standards that could be included into contracts. That was completed in 2013, and we started to roll out some pilot projects. We've done some measurements. And when we intervened in the market, which was sort of 2011, 2012, we were at the bottom of the market. We were post-crash. We had lots of contractors that were very hungry at that point, and we had an austerity challenge around more for less. So we proved that we could deliver assets more cheaply at a capex level, and more importantly than that, we created an awareness in the industry that digital was a useful thing in starting to deliver a more efficient industry. But it was a very low-level conversation, but it was the first conversation. We now have an opportunity to have, rather than a few tens of people in the debate, we've now got a few thousand people in the debate to do exactly what you just described around the next step. So how do we take this data set and enhance it, not only with a better quality of design information and manufacturing information, but also its in-service performance with the sensors and the things that we know about. So we can start to look at what was my brief, what did I set out to deliver, what did I design, what did I build, and what's operating. And those three data sets give us the opportunity to feed back and start to learn, and having learning assets actually puts us in a very different place in a few years' time. And that's exactly the journey that we anticipate going on.
May I add to that? Because I think that there is an enormous potential value down the route that your question goes. When we look at the value of information through the whole life of the asset, not just the delivery of the new asset. Now, I don't want in any way to denigrate the delivery of the new asset. We've got a lot of massive assets to deliver, and that's a really important thing. And increasing the productivity of construction would be very beneficial for us as a nation. So the delivery of new assets is clearly a very important thing, and I'm sure that off-site manufacture has a part to play. But then if we look at the wider picture of the performance of the assets in use, where we already have 99.5% of the assets that we need this year, we're only building a very small proportion of that, then the performance of the assets in use is clearly of a massive importance. And being able to manage the information through the whole life of the asset, and this picks up on Barrister Morgan's earlier question on whole life, looking at that whole life of the asset is clearly a route to even greater value. And BIM makes a connection through all of this. And so just one more thing to say on this is I think when we look at the performance of infrastructure assets through their whole life, then we can see the performance of infrastructure as a system, which is really about mathematics, and it's about what percentage of the theoretical capacity are we using. But we also see infrastructure as a service, and that's a very different thing when we look at it through the eyes of the ultimate customer and what the outcomes are for the ultimate customer. So I think when we talk about the performance of infrastructure, really we should be talking about both those things, performance as a system and performance as a service, because they are both incredibly important. And then if we increase the performance of infrastructure, that is likely to have an even bigger effect on national productivity than just increasing the productivity of construction alone.
And presumably, sorry, John, one further question, and presumably in the context of off-site manufacture, I mean, everything you've just both been saying applies equally, whether it's off-site manufacturer or not. But in the context of off-site manufacture, the ability to be able to, in the factory, put in various sensors in the same way as in an automotive factory that sensors are placed in the car components. It lends itself even more readily, arguably, than conventional construction. Is that right?
I think it absolutely does, because those smarts that we put into the components can be used in manufacturing, in delivery, and then in operation as well. And actually, the benefit will come from that whole life use of the smarts within the component, because if we can get the performance data of the components back into the front of the process and start to optimise the components, we'll see even more improvement. We understand very little about how these assets perform, either physically or from a consumer point of view. And the more data we can gather around that, the more analytics we can do, the more we can learn.
I think it's important to see off-site manufacture as part of a number of different related things that together will deliver greater productivity. I don't think that it's off-site manufacture by itself. And so what you point to on off-site manufacture maybe being a really good opportunity to get sensors built into the units, I think is exactly right. But then it's what those sensors then use for in the rest of the life of the asset that then will yield even more value. Sure. And so I think that if we see off-site manufacture as part of a suite of measures that we can drive within delivery of new assets to increase productivity, and then in an even bigger picture, as part of a bigger picture of infrastructure performance, then I think off-site manufacture's got its rightful place. If we see it as the whole of the picture, I think we'll be looking at too small a thing.
Okay.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. Before I turn to the question of overcoming barriers to the adoption of building information modelling, I just wanted to return to something that was said a moment ago about the value of this continuum of data from design through to manufacture, through to construction, and then through to actual performance and back again. Are there models, business models, that have been developed to capitalise on the value of that information, both in terms of its application to the domestic market and informing infrastructure construction and building management and so on in other parts of the world?
I think there's lots of fragmented ideas, but nothing has really been brought together. So where we are at the moment is lots of these data sets exist, but they're poorly understood and poorly accessed. So you mentioned one around building performance. The building management system data sets are very comprehensive, but they're almost impenetrable because the standards around them have made them impenetrable. And the number of skills in the operational parts of the supply chain are such that there's just not enough people that can interpret that data then to service it and start to make use of it. A lot of people are hiding behind IP and copyrights and those sorts of things. So the ability to share this stuff has been a real challenge. And as we move into a new contracting model, we need to ensure that the rights over that data can enable it to be collaborated with and shared, obviously within the constraints of contracts and security and those sorts of issues, which we've got to manage. We're not seeing any other nation doing massively better than us at the moment. I think probably the reverse. A lot of other nations have taken the UK standard as a model and replicated it. So, we see in Australia and Singapore and even the States, are using similar standards to us. The standards that we wrote as part of the first part of the programme have now been, or are in the process of being promoted to ISOs. So, it's a great UK story in terms of that part of the market. But we do see other sectors starting to do exactly what we're describing. So if we look at aerospace, where Rolls-Royce are now selling hours of thrust rather than engines, you actually do see a situation where engines used to be very expensive and unreliable, so that they could be maintained. So you had a big capex bill and a big opex bill. Then now, because you're paying for the outcome, actually these two bills have got very small, because they've designed all the flaws out of the engines. They become some of the most reliable machinery that we know. And it's been the commercial model that has driven that engineering input into the product to drive those flaws out. So they become, the time between servicing is enormous compared with what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. So we do see evidence in other sectors and other applications where it has worked well.
So does that mean that you could eventually have an infrastructure project or a major building project with all of this kind of data monitoring and pay for the performance of the building or the asset rather than principally the capital cost of constructing it?
I don't think that's impossible at all. I mean, the stranger things have happened. That's absolutely where we should be heading into those kind of ideas and opportunities, because it will drive better behaviour. And if we can drive more value out of our capex and opex pound and deliver better outcomes to citizens, that's exactly where we should be heading. And there's some good examples. If we look at High Speed 2, we're looking actively at the moment in how we can use these three data sets to predict faults at least 6 weeks before they ever happen. And that's one of the aspirations that we've got with that infrastructure, is any fault will appear and be detected, well before it ever becomes an operational issue. And they're the kind of aspirations that we're absolutely driving for right now. Whether that turns into, as you describe, a new contracting model for outcomes, maybe. I know Sellafield are looking at outcome-based contracting for their contracts, because they've got a very long investment in that asset, 2,000 years potentially for some of them. So those kind of scenarios, yes, we're seeing that starting to emerge.
And in terms of the broader question about adoption of this type of building modelling system, if I understood you correctly, the principal software technology asset is now owned overseas and has to be purchased by UK participants. Is that correct?
Yeah.
How can the government and how can the sector more generally ensure proper access? Do all participants in, let us say, a project need to have access to the same system?
So there's a number of components in this. There's the system that you use to create and author the information, a bit like Word on your PC. It's the equivalent to Word. It's an application. And then there's some data that drops out the bottom that you share, and someone else uses maybe another copy of Word or something then to go and look at that design. So the application that you use come and go. They'll get updated every year. But the key thing, the IP and the value, is in the data that sits underneath. And absolutely, we're looking at creating open standards around the data. We're not that worried about it. We want to create a market around better quality applications, so that's Word becomes Word 2020 in a few years' time, and it improves its functionality. What we're really interested in is the quality, the reliability, and the security of the underlying data, so that we can reuse it for other purposes. And that's really where the R&D question comes in. How do we drive the quality of this data up? We know what data we need. We've already got that data, but how do we massively improve the quality? And then how do we start to join it up with other pieces of data to make sense out of it? And that's...
The data must be evolving. I mean, you put up a gherkin or whatever it is in the city. I mean, that's going to be a big source of new data, isn't it? Or...
Absolutely, and the data that you start with at briefing is very thin, and when you hand it over into operations, it's very thick, so it grows in fidelity as well. And that's all part of the management process. And we've started the journey in understanding that sequence of events, and we've got a set of very basic standards around sharing that data, but it needs to be developed and improved, and that will be the next generation as to how we do that.
Sorry, can I just ask, I mean, you talked about outcome costing, but it used to be called some other word, in which a person puts up a hospital and just charges the government per hour. But the stories about that, I mean, it's had a pretty negative press, hasn't it? The whole process of not just put up a building, but as it were, charging by hour, particularly for public sector buildings. So why are you so positive about it in the light of...
The interesting thing about the method that you describe, PFI and PF2, is there was no feedback loop. It was a linear journey, and so we learnt nothing from it other than we had a very large bill at the end. What we have to do is to feed that data back into the front, and we missed a vital component. There is masses to be learnt from those projects. They wasn't all good, but some of that learning needs to be fed back in.
But I notice you don't use the word PFI. No. That's a sort of no word now.
We should take the learning.
Well, I understand. Output costing is a better word.
Yeah.
So may I add to both of these, which I think are connected? I mean, I think that one thing is for us to look further when we're talking about the outcomes. So consider what outcomes we actually want from infrastructure, and not just from a particular project. But we could look to to reducing reoffending rates, or to improving educational outcomes. If those are the outcomes we want, maybe those are the outcomes that should be rewarded. And it's got nothing to do with whether you build a prison or a hospital or a road. And so if the outcomes are what are wanted and the outcomes are what are rewarded, then that can open up all sorts of more interesting solutions, which aren't necessarily just building more. And there are many cases where we just don't have enough space to build more, so we need to think more cleverly. And therefore we should come up with cyber-physical solutions and digital solutions that release more capacity without having to build things. And that's really important then for us to have a whole life view, because there is a danger that the kind of sensors that Lord Mayor talks about are seen as a cost rather than as a value. Whereas what they're actually doing is releasing more capacity and should be seen as value. And then, sorry, it was just coming back to your point on the value chain, because I think it's entirely possible for us to see a new value chain which goes from data to outcomes, that built on the basis of better quality data, we can make better sense of that data, which then gives us better insights, which means we can make better decisions, which means we can get better outcomes. So there's a direct connection between data and outcomes. And so what would make sense with that view of value chain is to reward the adding of value to information rather than the time spent doing it. And we now have a number of cases where the amount of time we spend doing something like design does not make it getting paid for by the hour. Most recent example was something that used to take 15 days, now takes 4.5 seconds. And so we don't want to get paid on an hours-based model for that, but it does equate to productivity. That's exactly the kind of productivity we want. And so I think the message for me coming out of that is that we must change the business models. It's not just a case of we might like to look into what other business models are. It's an absolute necessity that we change the business models to release that kind of value.
Thank you. I should first of all declare my personal interests. I'm a Fellow of the British Academy and an Honorary Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. BIM is currently used for commercial buildings and infrastructure, and perhaps not quite so much for house building. And perhaps you could say more about the benefits it could have in the house building sector.
So it is used in house building, but less, for sure. So we do see organisations like L&Q and L&G and Lang & Rourke using it routinely. And we have big transformation programs to enable that, because they've kind of seen the benefits. I think all of these sectors are on a slightly different curve of adoption, and they're just on a slightly different timescale. So the application is very, very similar. It's an asset with components and data that can be managed in the same way. I think for sure that the volume of housing lends itself to using a component-based manufactured approach. And I think we'll see it accelerate massively in the future. But the challenge around that is going to be ensuring, as we said earlier, capacity in factories to enable that to sustain, and potentially the way that we distribute and encourage designers and suppliers to use the data in a standard common way. If we end up fragmenting that market through the intervention we make, we'll lose the opportunity.
It is potentially very sensitive, though, to downturns in the market, isn't it? I mean, you've got quite a long chain of sequence from the factory to the finished house, and if there's a downturn in the market, then there's a big investment that is rather hanging fire. Is that one of the problems that one faces?
I think that's that's a problem across the manufacturing sector. You've got a very high sunk cost in factories and materials and equipment, and anything that we can do through the intervention that we design here, either through the domestic market or the international market, to increase the demand, the better. And I think we need to focus on that, because this is a commercial conundrum that we're unlocking here. We know how to do this stuff. There's the teams and experience is in the UK. It's scaling it and scaling that capacity.
And I've got a very specific question, trying to think through volumetric construction for houses. And obviously one wants as large a unit as possible to be manufactured and brought on site. But does the 5 metre limitation on what you can transport by road prevent a difficulty when we're talking about house construction?
I think logistics is a really interesting constraint. Particularly, we mentioned London, inner city London. One of the biggest constraints around building in London is access, and access underneath the hoist to deliver the components. The bigger we can make those components when they're delivered, and the fewer lorries we can get into London, for sure, the better, both environmentally and all the congestion, all the things that go with that. But we mentioned earlier we have components, we have assemblies, and we have big assemblies, and we have buildings. The strategy around that is always going to be linked to a set of constraints that then get managed within the design. If you have a constrained site and or constrained access, you're going to have to build a smaller assembly. But you clearly want to make it as big as you sensibly can.
Your Hunt.
So you made some slightly cryptic remarks there about other countries of having ticky-tacky houses which are all the same and so on. But equally, some of these countries, I don't know whether you're referring to France, but is building them 3 times at the rate that we are doing so. People are quite content with that. But in those, as far as I can understand, in those countries, they have got a lot of these centres where they can get parts, or they've designed parts, and which they keep using year after year, and they do have this much higher volume of construction. So presumably part of the limitation of introducing these off-site methods is in fact the financial side in the UK, let's say compared with some other countries where it seems to have a longer continuous run. I mean, is that improving?
For sure, France has a bigger demand than the UK. It's a bigger country with more people, so there's more opportunity to grow that market. They're also much more used to having outcome-based methodologies in France. The one that I had in mind, though, around quality of architecture, particularly with Scandinavia, because you do see lots of buildings that look very, very similar. And China, they all look identical because they are. And what the impact that may be on future generations, we'll only see. We do know already that the work that the mental health people have done in that sector, there is a correlation between poor quality or small, poorly designed residential accommodation and mental health. We do not want to save a few pounds here and grow a massive bill over here. But by making the wrong decision, this is we don't want to view this as a big experiment. We want to get this right, and so I think there are lots of components in that question you just gave, and we need to understand each of them very clearly, because there is a danger that we could solve one problem and create another one that's actually much worse.
But I mean, in principle, the government or the Treasury could decide actually it is important to have a sort of a continuum of building. Whereas that doesn't seem to be very high on the Treasury's list of priorities. They go up and down, don't they?
The cyclical funding is a challenge. We've seen improvements over the last few years with departments like Highways getting 5-year deals rather than 1-year deals, which enables them to do big long-term projects like the Smart Motorways project, for instance, which has been enabled through that strategy. Because the government's got such a low input into the residential market, that's more difficult. The Homes England is more of a land property organisation now, and a small fund, I think less or around 15%. So there's a smaller lever for government to intervene in that particular market. If you look into prisons and schools, there's a much bigger lever because we're the client for a much bigger number of products. So we can start to insist on a standard set of products and a standard set of designs. So it really depends on which department we look at, what the agenda of that department is, and what their funding agreements are.
Thank you.
Dr. Pugh and Mr. Enzer, we're coming to the end of the session. But one thing you said is about the software, the BIM software, that is, have to be imported. In the cost of a building, what percentage of the cost is that we have to buy that software from overseas?
So again, mentioned earlier this kind of analogy between the software that you use, the tools you use, and the labour that you use to deliver it. The cost of the labour, the architect, is much higher than the cost of the tool itself. Okay. For some SMEs, there's a little bit of a barrier, but not much. We've over the last 5 years, the pushback hasn't been the cost of software. It's been the cost of training, and really, particularly from the manufacturers and the SMEs, nervousness that the government won't stay committed to this direction of travel. And these guys can do this, they have the capacity to do this, but they need a medium to long-term commitment so that we don't go over here and all this is wasted to, because that is actually catastrophic to them.
So in terms of the percentage of buildings, let's say schools, for instance, of the schools that are built in England, let's say, what percentage would use off-site construction?
Schools, I wouldn't
Or just take any example that you know.
certainly I know of several off-site schools for sure, and there's more now than there were there has been. It's a growing number.
Mr. Enzer, do you
No, I don't know what percentage it would be. It's low, though. It's a low percentage.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much indeed. It's been an interesting session. We thank you both for coming to your service. Thank you. We'll have a couple of minutes break while we have change of witnesses.
The proceeding is currently in private. 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 The proceeding is currently in private.
And welcome to this inquiry of ours, and thank you very much for coming today to help us with this inquiry. It's very important that we hear from you. And all of you, please, starting from my left, if you don't mind introducing yourselves so we get you on the record. And if you want to say anything as an introductory remark, please feel free to do so. So, Mr. Farmer, I'm going to start with you.
Good afternoon. My name is Mott Farmer. I'm the Chief Executive of CAST. It's a specialist real estate and construction consultancy working primarily in the residential sector, but having an input and involvement across the construction sector, including infrastructure as well. I'm a co-chair of Constructing Excellence, and I also authored an independent review of the construction sector back in 2016 entitled Modernise or Die. I'm a strong advocate of off-site manufacturing, and no doubt we'll develop that further in discussion. Some of the findings of my review from 2016 clearly suggest that developing new ways of building, designing and building is an integral part of how we're going to overcome the challenge, particularly about in terms of building new homes, but other critical infrastructure as well. So,
thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Radley. I'm Director of Policy at the Construction Industry Training Board, so the industry's training body funded by the levy. We have three primary roles which are all very relevant to this inquiry. One is supporting the sector to recruit and retain people through careers work, in helping the industry to develop the appropriate standards and qualifications, and influencing training and development. And we do this primarily through through three mechanisms, all of which are relevant: partnering with employers, training providers, other organisations, providing funding for companies to train, but also for programmes, and carrying out research. And we're increasingly, a lot of our research is looking at future opportunities and future skills.
Mr. Reynolds?
Good afternoon, and I'm the Chief Exec of Mace Limited. My name is Mark Reynolds. Mace is a privately owned consultancy and construction company. In addition, I'm part of the Construction Leadership Council responsible for skills workstream. I've also been a part of the Project 13 executive group responsible for integration. I started my career nearly 40 years ago as what they would now call as an apprentice, as a 16-year-old. I've worked on a number of high-profile projects such as Terminal 5, London 2012, where we were the delivery partner. And since becoming Chief Exec of Mace in 2013, we've grown organically from a £1 billion company to a £2 billion company, increasing our international revenues from 100 million a year to 600 million a year, investing over 40 million a year since 2015 in R&D projects. Today we employ 6,000 people across 40 countries, over 5 continents, and as well as being an owner and a CEO, I would class myself as a practitioner of lean and manufacturing and modern methods of construction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Elsy?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Dick Elsy. I'm the Chief Executive of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, and our job is to develop advanced manufacturing technologies and processes for the high value manufacturing sector, characterised by complex and high volume manufacture, aerospace, automotive, rail, defence, food and beverage. We were approached 18 months to 2 years ago by the Construction Leadership Council, and indeed following Mark Farmer's report, to understand how the disciplines from high volume and high value manufacture could be transferred into the construction industry for productivity gain and to meet the targets set in the strategy document Construction 2025. Since that time, we've helped develop technology route maps with the Construction Leadership Council and also helped develop the recent construction sector deal. And whilst doing that, we've engaged with leading construction companies and their supply chains on many projects to demonstrate what's possible. The use of digital tools and information management, robotics, automation, and the topic of today, off-site manufacture. And these demonstration projects have crystallised the view that the concept of that cross-sector knowledge transfer is fully workable and will lead to the kinds of productivity and cost improvement gains that the industry needs.
Thank you very much. Apropos of that, by the way, to any of you can answer, what is our productivity level compared to other countries in construction?
Well, the statistics are that we are between 15 to 25% less than other companies.
Such as which countries are we talking about?
Countries, sorry?
Which countries?
Germany, France.
And is that solely down to not being able to do more off-site construction?
Partly around efficiencies of health and safety. I think we have much higher health and safety requirements, much more stringent, which do actually slows the process down, and certainly being far more rigorous. And there is an element of having a production-based approach, certainly around design efficiencies and a system-based approach for materials, components, sub-assemblies, etc.
So in the components of productivity gains, you mentioned design, you mentioned some other areas. So how much would the off-site construction contribute to improving that productivity?
How much could it contribute?
Yes. Okay.
I think it could. Personally, I think it could contribute up to 50% increase, and maybe higher.
So that suggests that the other areas of design, etc., contribute very little to productivity.
Design is an important element. They're all integral. So if you design for manufacture, it would improve health and safety. Stringencies on health and safety, because you'd reduce the number of people on site, you'd reduce the efficiencies of delivering that on site, as well as making it more standardised.
Okay. So we've heard a lot about the benefits of off-site construction. In fact, I think we are sold about it. the positive comments we've heard. So what are the barriers? Clearly, all of you want more. As you said, Mr. Farmer, you are a champion of off-site construction. So what are the barriers to more construction being done off-site?
If I answer that in the first instance, I think there's several barriers. I think there's a supply chain issue in terms of the capacity and structure of the off-site market as it currently stands. So I work primarily, as I said, in the residential sector, so my focus is on housing and high-density apartment schemes. It's clear that the off-site market as currently shaped in the UK is quite fragmented. It's effectively a cottage industry. It has certainly come from that perspective, whereas individual businesses have finite capacity. And I think developing clients, house builders who want to engage with that method of building have often struggled to align with the right partners, to understand how their demand can actually map onto availability in factories. And it's been fairly sporadic in terms of matching supply and capacity. I think there's also a basic issue, and this goes to the heart of what I think is a key barrier to uptake in off-site. There's a big issue around how we organise ourselves as an industry around procurement, and how we organise in terms of a fragmented model of architects bespoke designing something that then gets procured in a competitive process, that then gets tendered through a ad hoc manufacturing supply chain, is not the best way of advancing off-site. And I think if we're going to really, really move forward on off-site manufacturing, there's a big piece of work to do around more integrated procurement. We have to move away, and there's a bigger debate about procurement in the construction industry, which is being flagged up by all sorts of other incidents in the last 12 to 18 months. We need to move to more collaborative procurement so that DFMA, which is a term you've probably heard several times in taking evidence, design for manufacturing and assembly, can be promoted properly, which is a different way. It's more collaborative, it's based on trust, and I think there's not enough of that in our industry, so it's a big barrier at the moment in answer to your question.
Okay. Anybody else want to contribute?
I think also best to look at how projects are funded. So if you look at the beginning of the whole process from concept design to developing that into funding, many of the large institutions, funders, just want to see tried and tested solutions, and if they're not proven, then it's a not invented here syndrome. So we don't have a process of doing prototyping. As a consequence, we learn on the job, and therefore it's difficult sometimes to get funding if you're trying to do something new. If you're trying to sell that into some clients, it's also difficult. And then, as Mark said, it's about the process, the design process, the traditional RIBA plan of work process, which the industry follows, does not really accommodate a manufactured construction solution.
Okay. Lord Borick.
I wanted to talk more about the drawbacks of the off-site manufacture and the barriers. You mentioned some of them before, but other ones that you wanted to bring out as to why it's not taken up more widely.
Well, as an industrialist looking into this sector, because we're bringing the disciplines from automotive and aerospace to the sector, it does require quite a mindset change. So there's quite a cultural shift in thinking from this rather sequential approach to a more integrated approach. So, for instance, the sort of things that we're looking at are the use of digital tools, so that there's one version of the truth from the first strokes of the architect's pen on a screen right through the whole the completion of that design, the tendering, the procurement processes, the physical build itself, and then onwards into the ongoing maintenance of the building. There's a single database, a constant handover of the baton all the way through that chain, and that requires quite a different mindset, which will be a challenge to accept. But the beauty is that aerospace and automotive are doing this. It's ubiquitous in aerospace and automotive. They're fully used to doing it. And the great thing is that the sector wants to change and wants to learn. So I don't see it being a barrier, and the first move advantage people who I've met through the Construction Leadership Council are determined to change. So there's quite a strong push to make that cultural shift.
Can I add to that in terms of some of the successes, and then we come back to the barriers? Many areas around pre-assembly of mechanical electrical plant coming in as modules has been a huge success in the industry and taken many hours out of the on-site labour process and improved safety. But the starting point is actually throwing away the design, which is done as a traditional design. So if a client spends, let's call it £1 million on design for it to be 30 to 50% thrown away to start again, they don't see that as an added value process. So then you have to accept that you have to move forward in order to make those savings. So it's that challenge and concerns that in terms of developing the design to start again and then move forward in a very different way. And people are reluctant to do that.
One of the problems here is that it's such a diverse industry that we're asking these questions not only about house building but also about multi-storey office buildings and hospitals and prisons and things, and they're so utterly different in their funding, in their maintenance, in the nature of the client, that we're trying to come out with questions that are relevant to totally different industries. Is that a fair analysis?
Yeah, I think we've definitely got within construction you have lots of different sub-asset classes. You have obviously difference between building construction and infrastructure, in terms of, but certainly physical infrastructure in terms of roads and railways. Social infrastructure is more going towards buildings, so we're talking about schools and hospitals. Housing is obviously a very clear element of that, as is commercial construction, offices, shopping centres, hotels, etc. I think you need to break it down into bite-sized chunks, and one of the key things here, and Dick and Mark have just alluded to it, is the mindset shift towards process-led thinking in construction, because what's clear in the construction industry is very unstructured. It has developed a model which is an historical one, which is not well suited to efficient working, and I think the learning we can take from other manufacturing-based sectors such as automotive and aerospace, and I don't want to overdo that comparison, but it's one that's well worth making, is about process. And actually, when you look at all those different asset classes of construction types and apply process to all of them and recognise the differences in terms of technical build, the design challenges or the rules by which they're built, you can actually do something very differently. And I think there's a fundamental shift here, and it's been covered several times already, between a client, and a lot of this starts with clients as to how they commission their projects. Rather than going to a designer and saying, I just want a design that meets this fairly open brief, there's a set of rules established, whether it be for a commercial office building or an apartment building, by which it codifies and parametrically defines how you would go about designing that. And then you enable that, and it's a bit like it's platform type thinking, product platform thinking that you get in the automotive sector. We can replicate that in construction. Lots of people think it's unachievable, but it will be achievable, and I think we're going to get there.
So which parts of the industry are perfect for off-site construction and which parts of the industry are rotten? I mean, my not knowing immediate leap is that prisons are perfect for this, but maybe that's suggesting that prisoners don't deserve good architecture. I'm not sure.
There's many areas. Prisons is a great example. Schools. Housing at all levels, be it low density, high density, they're both equally important. And it's this point that Mark raised, which is about creating that platform, be it a commercial office or a house or a high-rise residential facility. It has repetition in it in some shape or form, and it's creating those platforms, sub-assemblies and components and systems. So if you can create something with sub-assemblies and sub-assemblies that come together, then it's much easier to bring that. And then you get commonality at the sub-assembly level, which will start spreading across schools and hospitals. And just to use things that have been very common in residential, like particularly high volume, multi-storey residentials, bathroom pods. Bathroom pods were not used commonly 15 years ago. There was productivity problems and capacity problems. Bathroom pods today are used commonly. You now see utility cupboards used commonly on developments. A utility cupboard could be adapted for a school, it could be for a prison, as it could be the service. So these suddenly systems and components can become common platforms, and the advantage they give is you become a common product that you can then buy off the shelf. use many times, and plug into a building. You can plug into the design, which means you're actually using a system-based design rather than a designer designing it over and over again from first principles.
I think there is a misconception that this modular construction, off-site construction, leads to sort of porter cabin cities. I think the analogy that I would draw from the industries that I'm very familiar with is the automotive industry. And when I started there in the 1980s, every car was different, and the industry suffered from every car being engineered differently. Now, there is incredible commonality of components and systems in cars. So if I take Volkswagen Group, they have a MBQ, it's called platform, a single platform, which is things like brake systems, axles, engines, all of those common parts, serves 4 brands and 25 different products. So the products all look different, different brands, appeal in different ways, so they're architecturally, to the consumer, very different products. But they share this very, very high common core with all the benefits that Mark's just talked about: high volume throughput, high quality parts, certified bits. It can be made to work. So I think that's the best analogy I can bring.
Baroness Morgan, then Lord Caker. Oh, sorry, Baroness Young, and then Lord Caker. And then Baroness Morgan.
Thank you. I'm curious about the house building industry, because it seems to me that it, with some exceptions, it's an industry which is very much driven by the volume house builders who've got a vested interest in not building very fast. It must be the only bit of the construction industry that thrives on going slow. And I just wonder whether that means that this approach is doomed to failure in the volume house building industry, unless we get you talked about change of culture, unless we get a major mindset shift. Discuss.
As I go there, I might add to it, is that Mr. Farmer and Mr. Reynolds, you both have experience overseas. So how does that experience compare here? To link with that question.
So if I answer the question about house building incentive to adopt this first, and then I'll open it up to overseas benchmarks. You're right, there's not necessarily an incentive in the private for sale house builder model to build fast, and obviously one of the benefits of off-site is speed. But what we're seeing very clearly, and it's been magnified in the last 18 months, is that we have a big issue in this country around quality. And what's becoming more apparent is the big house builders are recognising that is becoming a reputational and brand risk for their businesses. So even though the speed piece might not actually fit with their core business model around having unsold inventory, if they're delivering products ahead of their sales rate, that could be an issue. But they recognise, I think they're increasingly recognising, and you can see it, there's actual evidence out there of volume house builders, some of the top 5 actively looking at off-site manufacturing solutions, either through partnership with existing manufacturers or in some instances looking to vertically integrate and set their own factories up. And Berkeley Group would be an example of that, and some of you may be aware that Berkeley are, as we speak, they're building a factory in the Thames Estuary which will be for their own product and pipeline. And that's born out of the risk, I think. If you speak to their board, it will be out of the fact they saw a reputational risk around poor quality because of the skills constraints they're now seeing, and the variability of outcome of traditional build. Just quickly on the overseas piece, I have to say, and I think it was said in the previous session, there's no standout country here that's doing something remarkably different across all parts of housing. So there are some well-known examples of single-family housing being done in a more manufactured way. Germany is an example of that, where you have single-family homes that are actually in many respects seen as premium products, like the Hoof House, and many of you will be aware of that. But if you look at high-density apartment-led schemes being delivered in a manufactured way, I can't really point to any international exemplar out there that does that. And Japan's another example that does a lot of single-family housing in a pre-manufactured way. But I think we have an opportunity here, if we embrace it and do it well and do it in a considered way, to be an international leader in this market.
Just to add to the point that Mark raised, this low volume, low rise, which is where it does lend itself to setting up an off-site manufacturing facility. And just take car plant as an example. The analogy is that is the assembly area And as you said in the last session, the constraint is actually putting it on the back of a vehicle and transporting it down the road. There was no reason why we couldn't create those sub-assembly areas local in a pop-up factory close to the large-scale development. So I think there is this area around low-rise, low-volume is very different to high-volume, high-rise, and they are very different solutions and don't try and do the same thing. The second part about international, I think if you look at different places around the world, where it be in the Middle East, where it thrives on low wages, lots of people, not treated in the same environment that perhaps we are in the UK, I think you have to be very careful. The quality of the type of work done in different locations in Germany, France is probably equivalent to the UK. Well, it is equivalent generally. But if you look at Russia, they only build what they call a grey box, which is basically block work and a facade, and then it's left to the individual to actually plaster the walls, do the electrics, do the kitchen and bathroom. So it's a very different market. So when you look at a house build in one country to another country, there are different products and different solutions, and there is a vast difference.
Can you give me a sense of these elements that might be constructed and applied to different types of buildings? What kinds of things are we talking about that could be done on a very large scale? The kinds of things that a pop-up factory might do, or indeed the factory you spoke about in the Thames Estuary might be doing?
I think lots of these methodologies coming forward are applying different solutions. So the factory I mentioned in the Thames Estuary that Berkeley are bringing forward is a volumetric solution. So the intention there is to three-dimensionally pre-construct an entire apartment or part of an apartment or part of a house. So that particular solution will be for houses and for higher rise. They're using steel, so it has structural integrity to go higher. So they're looking at that as part of the core piece of their business plan. And so that's the extreme. I think taking Mark's point around sub-assemblies and the hierarchy of how you pre-assemble parts of buildings, there's certain elements of commonality which will move beyond asset classes. So structure is an obvious thing. So moving towards more pre-manufactured structure, which would be invariably things like pre-casting concrete rather than in situ pouring concrete, which is highly prevalent, particularly in house building. So it's a very labour-intensive part of how we build structures that could be broken down into something that's a lot more pre-manufactured and platform designed. I think as you move into different asset classes and you look at the difference between housing and commercial offices, there's going to be a divergence in the type of sub-assemblies that you will need. So there'll be elements around things like engineering, infrastructure, risers, staircases, lift shafts, etc. that go into the central part of buildings that you can see. There'll be an office version of that, a hotel version of that, a residential version of that, and there'll probably be ability to have multiple platforms between each of those. As you move into the fitting out, it will become even more divergent, because obviously you only have kitchens and bathrooms usually in residential, you don't have that in commercial. So you break down, it's like a matrix picture as to how you break buildings down into bits. And then, as Mark said as well, I think there's the big debate as to whether you do it in a central factory, highly pre-manufactured, whether you use flying factories or pop-up factories co-located to site, or even, at its most extreme, you form the factory environment at the workplace, which has been done, and actually Mark's done that with his own business. So it's just a matter of technical detail as to how you break it down, but the key thing is consistency. Platform approach is commonality, as Dick said, is what they do in automotive. So rather than reinventing, and I work on too many schemes where we might have a 100-unit apartment scheme and there might be 85 different bathroom types, and it doesn't make any sense. It's not driving value, it's because of the individuality of the approach to design.
Can I just elaborate on that and give you an example? So a multi-storey building over 32, 34 floors, you could engineer that so you could actually get another floor within the building without actually affecting the overall height. That can be constructed, and the building that Mark mentioned was what we called a jump factory, where we built a large factory on top of the building. We were able to construct the floor, cladding, walls, structural walls, columns, staircases, prefabricated bathrooms, utility cupboards, service modules, horizontal, vertical, in 38 hours. Now, I have never seen that done anywhere in the world. So it can be done. What we need to do is understand how we standardise that and take that forward as an industry and work together. Now, this client that we work with bought into the concept. And we had some failures on that project, and we had some successes. But he's given us a very similar building, and actually we've taken that lessons forward and onto the next scheme, and we'll take those lessons into other schemes. But the point I think we're all making is about it has to be engineered at the beginning. It has to be based on a system and sub-assembly base, and then you can create that manufacturing. We haven't really spoken about the skills of the workforce, and it does change the mindset of both the management team and into the site installation team, because they do become an assembly team, which is much safer and much more productive.
Then goes on to Baroness Morgan's question.
I wanted to ask you about skills. I mean, can you talk through for us the change of the skill base that you'd need for more off-site, and the sort of advantages and disadvantages? I mean, we know there's a skill shortage now in current construction that arguably is going to get worse because of the age profile and probably with Brexit. So we know we've got a problem, but where do we get what are the new skills that are going to be needed, and where do we get that from?
Like kick off with that. I think first of all there are some big. I only talk about the things I know about. I think as well as skills challenges, there are some big skills opportunities here. If we get the initial entry-level training, whether that's apprenticeships, T-levels, degree courses, if we get those right, then I think we can have the opportunity to have a much more productive workforce. And I think if you look, there are different roles in construction that will be affected in different ways, and in some cases new roles are being created, but there are some skill needs that are in common. Those are to do with team working, multi-skilling, quality management, having much better understanding of digital skills, better communication, all those sort of factors, some of those that are commonly regarded as soft skills. I think if we're actually developing the training and the upskilling to deliver those skills, we've got the opportunity to create a much more productive workforce. I think also if it's a better working environment on-site and off-site, it will actually help the industry in terms of its recruitment and retention challenges, because it will be a more attractive industry to work in. And I think in some cases there may be benefits for some of the problems that construction industry faces more than others, such as mental health and in extreme cases suicide, because we'll be working in a less stressful environment. And I think also one of the advantages of off-site is you don't need all the workforce together on one site. You can do the work where the workforce is located, so there's less need for people to be young people to be away from home, living in rented accommodation, things like that, and that tends to be associated with high levels of stress and in extreme cases suicides. If you then look at the sort of the specific challenges, it creates new roles in terms of on-site assembly, and I think in those cases there's a lot more emphasis on precision, using things like BIM, logistics management, communication. If you look more at the off-site environment, people working in the factory, it's about producing those components, so fixing, tiling, wiring those, and bringing them together into modules. And also, again, having a better understanding of digital skills and the ability to work in a production line. And at sort of the other extreme, it's really enhancing the role of, say, a digital designer. So in those cases, you need to understand 3D modelling and have the ability to use modelling to design and actually then test processes and modules. So I think it creates a range of new skill needs and opportunities. And I think what we then need to think about is how we build these into entry-level training. So developing new trailblazer standards that reflect both some of those specific skills but also some of the skills I've talked about that are in common, and also looking at the new T-levels which are going to be coming into force in a couple of years. One of the emphasis is on multi-skilling, so that particularly in the first year of training you get an understanding of a greater range of trades, and I think that will be really important in terms of developing some of the skills that we needed to make off-site construction more successful.
And I mean, take the T levels. Are they being developed? Are they being developed for sort of modern construction, or are they being developed for existing skills? Who's in the driving seat on those?
Well, I think they'll be developed for a mixture of the two, and I think in terms of who's in the driving seat, I think it's very much up to employers to work very closely with government and training providers to make sure that the right content is developed in training, that and I think it's a CITB role to make sure that we have sufficient trainers, assessors to deliver that. And then one of the key elements is ensuring that we have sufficient employers that are able to provide work experience, work placements for 3 months in those areas. But I think the T levels we get will be very much dependent on employers getting involved. You know, the T levels you get will be the T levels you deserve if you've put in the effort to influence them.
And is that happening? Because my impression is that sort of post 2008 there was a complete crash in terms of training, really. Well, people have been pretty reluctant to come back to the table.
I think if you look at T levels, initially they will be fairly low volume. I think this will be a very gradual rollout over the next 5 years or so. I think certainly in the shorter term, the primary route for construction to bring people in will be through apprenticeships, and certainly we've seen pretty strong growth in apprenticeship numbers in the last few years. And while some people have commented that with the apprenticeship levy coming in, apprenticeship numbers have dropped off in other sectors, they've held up very well in construction. So I think there is an increasing understanding amongst construction employers that if they're to get the skills they need and to become more productive, that they need to invest more in training.
I think there's a couple of things we need to be honest with ourselves when it comes to training. The industry did drop to something like 7,000 apprentices. Yep. During 2007, 2008, it's nearer 23,000 today. If you then look at, and there's an aspiration from the Construction Leadership Council to get that up to, and the industry to get up to 30,000 apprentices a year. There is reluctance on T levels because of the demand placing young students into the workplace for 3 months, which is a challenge and needs to be addressed by the industry. And we shouldn't hide that hasn't been resolved yet. And then there is the thing about the question you asked about changing for the future. And we've had various discussions amongst ourselves in the industry about how do people adapt their workforce. And there's some good examples around the likes of NG Bailey, who have taken their business from being an on-site to partially off-site, where they've been building modules in their own manufacturing centres. And they evolve those skills. So you start off as a specialist, and then you evolve probably into a generalist doing multiple skills, but they don't go necessarily for specialist training because they start off with that specialism. And I think we'll see both specialism at the beginning and then going into generalists, which will be easier in the future. And it comes down to how people design things, the design, so they're plug and play design for manufacture. And I think probably Dick's probably got better references for that from the automotive industry.
Yeah, I mean, it is with all the industries that we serve, and now, of course, supporting construction, that one of the biggest challenges is these advanced skills. I mean, the further education colleges are taking apprentices to a certain level. So in the industries I serve, they know how to operate a lathe, but they don't know all of the digital tools and techniques. And there's actually quite a big void above that. So we're trying to plug the gap, working with DFE, which is a challenge since it's separated, skills separated from biz into DFE. There's this lack of understanding about these advanced skills needed. So construction will face the same challenge, I'm afraid, but they will join with us in being a powerful force in calling for funding principally to put into development of the curriculum and standards and everything. Then the colleges then can distribute all of that and get on with it. But that will be a challenge for sure.
And to what extent is the work being done to demonstrate how the skill is it out there, how the skills need to change, or is that just quite vague at the moment? Because you gave it, Mr. Radley, you gave us a sort of spiel of a load of stuff, but I'm not clear whether we're saying so we need X number. In 10 years' time we think we're going to shift to needing X number of these people, and this is how we're going to take it forward.
We've done some quite detailed work in this area, and I think what we've done is we've defined 6 key roles within the industry, and some examples of those are the ones I've talked about already, in terms of on-site assembly, off-site assembly, digital design, site managers and that type of thing. And I think in each case what we're looking at is what are the new skills, but also which are the roles which are going to change. For example, if you look at the site manager, I think a lot more emphasis is going to be about quality management. It's going to be about behavioural change, getting people working together effectively. But probably in the more advanced forms of offsite, that is going to become a more general manager role, where you've got the ability to manage from start to finish, from conception to completion of the project. So it's going to require both new skills but also enhancement of existing ones. And I think one of the challenges is then influencing the design of courses, both in terms of, in some cases there'll be new courses being developed. So for example, there's a new digital engineer apprenticeships being developed, but in many cases it's going to be about embedding these off-site concepts in existing courses. So for example, Mark talked about DFMA. We need to make sure it's mainstream in a range of different digital courses already, design courses already.
So there's a particular piece of work going on as we speak actually for London around housing, and it's quite a difficult area because what you're trying to do is forecast future skills needs, and they have to be demand-led. So ultimately, running the courses for these new developed skills in the different areas that Steve's mentioned has to be embedded on the fact that employers want those skills. And that, in turn, is reliant on us changing the way that we build. So the London piece of work is looking at housing. It's looking and it's making projections as to what proportion of our new build housing in London in the future, over a 5-year timescale, will change towards more modern methods, more manufactured approaches. And then you have to model, and it's quite high level because you have to model what kind of skill profile that looks like in terms of how many traditional tradesmen, how many assemblers, logisticians doing different things in different ways, how many DFMA specialist architects will be required. But it has, we're not going to transform our skills base in this country unless it's demand-led. And I think that's where the government's role and some of the policy announcements that have been made in the last 9 months or so are really important around starting to initiate some level of change where it's within the government's control, particularly around major capex programmes in the 5 government departments that were announced in the budget in terms of moving towards a presumption towards modern methods. That is a good start in terms of trying to start shaping a level of demand that then the FE, HE providers can respond to because they know this is coming from the government's own programme, and hopefully that will spill into housing and commercial buildings, etc., etc.
My question. So, which brings to what you just said, what actions are needed from the government and from the sector on skills to meet the changing needs of construction? What wider actions are needed? I mean, one of the things is to do with the treasury and the fluctuation. That seems to be one of the issues. But I was going to say one of the interesting things we've heard is that what Mr. Ely is involved in a Catapult program. This is this one you're bringing together vehicles and aerospace and construction. I mean, there have been some reports about catapults, about them, some being more successful than others. And would you like to sort of comment on the catapult sort of model in this program? How has that contributed?
In the construction program, well, first of all, the Catapult program is about bridging between the UK's fantastic science base. We spend a lot of money on the development of science, but we have a market failure in the UK in that we don't exploit enough of it as manufacturing value add. And the job of the Catapult program is to bridge that gap and bring more science through for industrial solutions. And the Catapult that I run, High Value Manufacturing, has been very successful in doing that. So in the first 6 years of operation, we've leveraged off £330 million of government funding, a total of £1 billion of R&D activity, with some fantastic new processes, new factories built, inward investment off the back of it. So it's a very successful model. And what we're looking to do here is to apply that well-proven model in construction. And if we're successful in the construction sector deal bids, we hope to provide a place for constructors to come and develop new processes. So it's a separate organisation, the structural side, is it, compared with the aviation and vehicles? No, it's all one. We're multi-sector. We're sector agnostic. Although I'm describing advanced manufacturing, typically aerospace, automotive, food and beverage, rail, marine. but construction is now joining us. But we are uniquely sector agnostic, so the tools and techniques we're using are freely available because they've been supported by a government contribution to the construction industry. About a third of our funding comes from government.
And do the apprentices in construction, do they go and visit the factories?
Well, they will be. That, you know, we've got experiments running now with most of the major manufacturers. We've had school children coming to see things being assembled by robots. Glass cladding on buildings, the construction of entire roof sections of buildings done robotically. Those are available to see, and we've been engaging with youngsters on that. But that really, just at the foothills of that, of developing those techniques. But key to that will be bringing the youngsters and reskilling people to show them what this new world looks like, to get them comfortable with it and get the skills developed. And there lies the challenge. We can't do it all in our facilities because we're sort of busy getting on with delivering the technology.
So how much of the money for this comes from the government and how much from the private industry?
To our model, about a third of the funding comes from government to provide core capability, keep the lights on, buy the equipment. A third from industry for using the equipment. And the final third we win on collaborative projects. So the projects have to be innovative, competitive and collaborative to win them. It's a very good model.
And did you have any supplementary?
Really, one last question. If there was one thing that government could do to kind of break this cycle of, we haven't got enough skills, it's not moving fast enough, people aren't firing up to it, when we had evidence last week, we kind of felt that this thing was stuck in a loop and nobody could break out of it. If government could do one thing to really break out of the loop, what would it be?
I've got a couple, if you don't mind.
Yeah, two's even better. Twice as good.
Well, first of all, the sector deal is really important to the construction and infrastructure industry, and that will be enabler both for, as Dick says, about the third approach, so people then start doing it. I think also HMRC could take a slightly different approach, and it's about being an enabler and helping organisations. So if you're investing 40-50 million a year in R&D projects, there is no reason why those R&D tax credits couldn't be increased. And in actual fact, HMRC could, for some reason, they've taken a dislike, I think, to construction over the last 6 months and been more stringent on.
Construction industry more disadvantaged than any other industry for R&D?
I can't comment. I don't work in any other industry, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I work for many other industries, but I think pharmaceuticals.
Would it not strengthen your case if you knew that you were disadvantaged?
Pharmaceutical do very well, I believe, Lord Chairman. I think also. But I do think there are other industries who get a hard time, like IT. So we probably sit at the bottom of the food chain, and I think automotive, aviation, and pharmaceutical do very well, and probably have been playing the game much better than us over the last 10 years. So I think there's HMRC working with industry on the R&D tax credit and demonstrating the benefits, because there's real benefits to be accrued to industry through doing that.
And if I have an observation, again, as this industrialist, I think governments are clearly a big procurer of construction infrastructure projects to get behind this. I see that the construction industry is determined to change. There are some front runners in their determination to change, and I'm sitting next to one of them. It's encouragement with the new wave of government construction projects to not say mandate, but to encourage the use of this new approach. I think it's a pretty obvious thing to do.
I'd really like to underline that point, because I think there are a lot of things CITB and industry can do in terms of running careers campaigns to advertise the new roles, to influence training provision and get qualifications right, persuade training providers to put these courses on, help them to develop trainers and assessors. But if they've not got the confidence that the work's going to be there, all of this is really going to be fairly fruitless. So really giving a push to that employer demand side is the really crucial thing.
Yeah, times 3 on that. So demand planning is at the heart of all of this. So we suffer from being a highly cyclical industry. So it's at the root of so much of how we really struggle. We've configured ourselves as quite a flexible, resilient industry, but I think with the skills constraints that we have coming forward, that's going to be increasingly difficult. So anything that the government can do around its direct spend programme and the National Infrastructure and Construction Pipeline is an important piece of that, around certainty and actually beyond parliamentary cycles. That's a key thing here. We need long-term certainty. How in the housing sector it's slightly more difficult because obviously the only tools in the armoury from Homes England's perspective is probably land. So it's still there's an ability to influence there. And actually, from a housing perspective, which is the market I concentrate on, that cyclicality can be a real barrier to people wanting to change the way that they do things. So if there's any way in which policy can support counter-cyclical or acyclical demand stimulation for house building, then at least the industry knows there's a floor there of minimum demand that then gives some certainty around investment in different techniques, manufacturing, the R&D that's been mentioned, and I agree with Mark's point around the HMRC piece on that as well. But there's definitely a role for government to initiate that change and to underpin the change, albeit we still need private sector involvement in that as well.
Reynolds and then Lord Mayor.
Let's put it around to the private sector thing for a while. Let's take housing, which is relatively simple. I mean, here you have something which I think you mentioned. You could have a 50% increase in productivity. You can get improvement in the quality of what's done. And presumably you could significantly reduce the costs here as well. I mean, I still don't understand quite why it is that the private sector on its own, or some really disruptive, courageous folk in the private sector, can't do it. And I'm slightly uneasy about, if the government did this, it'd all come good. Well, is there nobody there who would break ranks and say, yeah, we're going to do it? We're going to deal with the lack of vertical integration or whatever else it may be, and so on and so forth, and we're going to cut prices of all this big way. It can't be done?
I think that's coming. So there's definitely disruption afoot. And I think that, in terms of this pace at which the private sector moves to this model, I've already mentioned some of the drivers for change, which are probably more negative drivers, so people being forced there because of their